Imagine this. It's World War II, high above the skies of Europe. A German fighter pilot lines up his shot on an American B-17 bomber. He unleashes a barrage of cannon fire, riddling the plane's tail. The bomber shudders violently, smoke pouring from its engines, pieces of metal shearing off into the wind. The German pilot watches, certain he's just scored a kill. But then, something impossible happens. The B-17, against all odds, levels out and keeps flying. This wasn't just a one-time fluke. This was the story of a very special B-17 Flying Fortress, a plane that earned a legendary reputation among both Allied and Axis pilots. Time and time again, this bomber would limp back to base, looking more like a skeleton than an aircraft. It would return with its nose cone shattered, its wings full of holes, and sometimes with its tail section barely hanging on. German pilots who encountered it were baffled. They'd report shooting it down, only to see it appear on the next mission, patched up and ready to fight again. They started calling it the ghost ship, or old battle wagon. They couldn't believe a machine could endure so much punishment and refused to fall from the sky. One German report allegedly stated, "This American bomber is not made of metal, but of pure will." The crew's stories were just as incredible. They spoke of the plane shaking so hard it felt like it would tear itself apart, yet it always held together long enough to get them home. They flew through storms of anti-aircraft fire and swarms of enemy fighters. On one mission, the plane lost 2 of its 4 engines and had its oxygen system knocked out, but the pilot managed to fly it back to England. This bomber became a symbol of incredible resilience. It wasn't just a machine. It was a testament to the skill of its builders and the sheer determination of the crews who flew it. Each scar on its fuselage told a story of survival, of a narrow escape, of a crew that refused to give up. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the toughest spirits are found in the most battered frames. What an incredible piece of history. Stories like these show the unbelievable courage and engineering from that era. Years before America entered the war, strategists imagined a battlefield high above the earth. Industrial centers, railways, and factories became targets. They concluded that precision bombing could cripple a nation without waiting for ground armies. Heavy bombers were designed to survive. The B-17 Flying Fortress carried guns at every angle. The B-24 Liberator could carry heavier loads over longer distances. Daylight missions promised accuracy but invited danger. Flak and fighter patrols filled the skies, yet the Americans trusted in formation flying, defensive firepower, and their engineering. From English airfields, the 8th Air Force launched these machines into hostile skies. Their mission was simple in theory: penetrate Germany, strike critical targets, and return. But in practice, survival was anything but certain. German pilots of the Luftwaffe were skilled, experienced, and confident. Bf-109s and Fw-190s had dominated skies across Europe. Intercept tactics were precise: quick, powerful attacks from behind or above, targeting engines and fuselages. When American formations appeared, the German pilots expected easy kills. Yet the bombers fought back. Their gunners fired relentlessly. Tight combat boxers created lethal overlapping fields of fire. Pilots were shocked. Aircraft riddled with flak, trailing smoke, even missing engines, still flew. Damage that would have destroyed other planes was only temporary. The Germans realized they were facing something extraordinary. The secret was threefold: engineering, crew discipline, and formation tactics. B-17s and B-24s were built to survive. Redundant controls, self-sealing fuel tanks, reinforced fuselages, and armor over critical positions. Engines could continue with partial damage. Inside, crews worked as a system. Pilots compensated for engine failures. Gunners extinguished fires. Radio operators coordinated. 10 men, functioning as one, kept the aircraft airborne. And then there were the formations, flying in combat boxers. Each bomber's guns protected not only itself, but its neighbors. Enemy fighters faced walls of bullets from all directions. Discipline and coordination turned vulnerability into strength. Have you ever heard the saying, "Truth is stranger than fiction"? Well, During World War II, the skies over Europe were the stage for a story so incredible, it sounds like it was pulled straight from a Hollywood movie. This is the story of the American Flying Fortress and the psychological war it waged against the very pilots trying to shoot it down. Imagine you're a young German fighter pilot in 1943. You're confident, you're skilled, and you're flying one of the most advanced aircraft in the world, the Messerschmitt Bf-1A9. Your mission is simple: intercept and destroy the waves of American bombers attacking your homeland. You line up your target, a massive 4-engine B-17 bomber. You press the trigger, and your cannons roar to life, tearing huge chunks out of its wing and fuselage. Smoke pours from an engine. By all logic, the bomber should fall from the sky, but it doesn't. It just keeps flying. This wasn't a one-time fluke, it was a daily reality. The B-17, nicknamed the Flying Fortress, was an engineering marvel of its time. It was designed with incredible redundancy. It could lose an engine, sometimes two, and still limp back to base. Its airframe could be riddled with holes from bullets and shrapnel, looking more like Swiss cheese than an airplane, yet its crew would somehow manage to bring it home. The Germans even gave it a nickname, Das Fliehende Stachelschwein, which means the flying porcupine, because of its 13 .50 caliber machine guns that could fire in nearly every direction. Now, put yourself back in that German cockpit. You make another pass, and another. You see your shells hitting home. You see fire. You see damage that would obliterate any other plane. But the bomber formation holds steady, their defensive fire lashing out at you from all angles. And the one you've been attacking, it's still there, a wounded, smoking giant that simply refuses to die. This started to have a profound psychological effect. Hermann pilots who were initially masters of their domain began to feel a sense of hopelessness. They Gaid it Vermitschreck, or Pharyngean fright. It was a creeping dread that set in every time they were scrambled to face the American bomber streams. General Adolf Galland, a legendary German ace, wrote about it in his memoirs. He described the sheer, demoralizing sight of hundreds of these bombers, flying in tight combat box formations, their guns creating a wall of lead. The odds were just overwhelming. For every bomber they shot down, it felt like 10 more took its place. They were fighting a war of attrition. They simply couldn't win. One of the most famous examples is the story of the B-17, the old pub. After being hammered by German fighters during a raid on Bremen, its nose was shattered. One engine was dead, another was damaged, and most of its gunners were wounded or knocked out. It fell out of formation, a sitting duck. A German ace named Franz Stigler was ordered to finish it off, but as he flew alongside the crippled bomber, he saw the terrified, wounded crew inside. He saw the pilots struggling to keep the plane level. Instead of shooting it down, Stigler chose compassion. He escorted the bomber to the North Sea, saluted the American pilot, and flew Hawaii, letting them live. He couldn't bring himself to destroy the ghost ship that had already endured so much. This resilience wasn't just about the machine, it was about the men inside. The 10-man crews of these bombers faced incredible danger on every single mission. They flew 4 hours in freezing, unpressurized cabins, breathing through oxygen masks, all while being hunted by fighters and targeted by anti-aircraft fire. Their bravery in the face of such odds was the other half of the equation. The story of the Flying Fortress is more than just a tale of a tough airplane. It's a testament to the power of resilience, both mechanical and human. It shows how technology and sheer determination can create a weapon so formidable that it starts to break the enemy's spirit, not just with its firepower, but with its simple, stubborn refusal to give up. It was a psychological blow that helped turn the tide of the air war over Europe. Thanks for watching. If you found this piece of history fascinating, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories you might not have heard before. See you next time. October 14th, 1943. The second Schweinfurt mission, 291 B-17s depart England, carrying the promise of crippling Germany's ball-bearing industry. Flak erupts, explosions tear through wings and fuselage. Engines smoke, yet crews press on, maintaining formation and altitude. German fighters swarm, firing with deadly precision. Bombers are hit, some fatally, but others, damaged beyond expectation, continue to Schweinfurt. Bombs are dropped with precision. Factories are struck, losses are heavy, but the resilience of these machines and crews is undeniable. Planes that should have fallen remain aloft, a living demonstration of endurance in the sky. The flight home is a test of will and machine. One bomber loses half its tail, a wing sags, engines fail. Yet it continues. Pilots compensate for asymmetric thrust. Gunners fire while wounded. Radio operators relay vital information. German pilots circle. Bewildered. Planes that should have fallen do not. Each successful return undermines the assumption that these aircraft are fragile. Hours later, the battered formations reach England. Engines smoke, fuselages bent, yet nearly all make it back. Schweinfurt proves a lesson for the ages. Discipline, engineering, and courage can defy what should be impossible. When the engines finally went silent, the cost of endurance became clear. Across the airfields of England, returning bombers told two stories at once: survival and loss. Of the aircraft that had set out, many did not return. Crews were missing. Empty spaces on the runways marked the absence of machines that had vanished over Germany. The 8th Air Force had paid heavily. Missions like Schweinfurt proved that even the strongest formations could not escape unscathed. Flak and fighters had taken their toll, exposing the limits of self-defending bombers. Yet among the losses, another reality stood out. Aircraft that did return were often barely intact. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress came back with shattered fuselages, engines destroyed, control systems damaged, and still they landed. Ground crews moved quickly, assessing damage, replacing parts, and preparing the aircraft for future missions. What seemed like destruction was often only temporary. For American planners, the lesson was unavoidable. Endurance alone was not enough. New strategies began to take shape. Long-range escort fighters like the North American P-51 Mustang would soon accompany bombers deep into enemy territory, reducing losses and changing the balance in the skies. For the Luftwaffe, the lesson was equally stark. These bombers could not be underestimated. They required greater coordination, more aggressive tactics, and higher risk to destroy. The air war had shifted from predictable interception to a contest of endurance, where neither side could rely on simple assumptions anymore. In the weeks that followed, the story of survival began to spread. Each returning aircraft carried more than damage. It carried proof that the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was more than a machine. Crews spoke of aircraft that had absorbed hundreds of impacts, yet remained airborne. Ground crews documented the scars: torn aluminum, burned engines, fractured wings, and turned them into something remarkable: aircraft ready to fly again. For American airmen, this created a quiet confidence. Not certainty, not invincibility, but belief. Belief that the machine could endure long enough to bring them home. Inside each mission, that belief mattered. It steadied hands, focused minds, and gave crews the strength to act when everything around them suggested failure. For German pilots, the effect was harder to ignore. Encounters with damaged bombers became stories passed between squadrons. Aircraft that should have fallen did not. Targets that appeared finished returned. The sky no longer offered simple victories. Frustration grew, so did respect. Because what they faced was no longer just an aircraft. It was a system of engineering, discipline, and relentless production. Over time, the legend formed. The Flying Fortress, not just for its guns, not just for its armor, but for its refusal to die. And in that legend, the air war found something unexpected. A weapon not only of destruction, but of endurance, shaping the outcome one return at a time. In the end, the sky remembers everything. It remembers the roar of engines straining against gravity. It remembers the bursts of flak tearing through cold air. And it remembers the bombers scarred, burning, broken, that refused to fall. The story of the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress is not simply a story of war. It is a story of endurance, shaped by necessity. In a conflict defined by scale and destruction, survival itself became a form of resistance, a quiet defiance against the forces trying to tear both machine and crew apart. These aircraft were never indestructible. They burned, they broke, they fell. But what made them remarkable was not their perfection. It was their ability to keep flying even after the point where failure seemed inevitable. Inside each bomber, 10 men faced the same reality. There was no certainty of return, only training, discipline, and trust in each other, and in the machine holding them together at altitude. When the fuselage was torn open and the wind roared through the cabin, when engines failed and instruments flickered, survival depended not on a single action, but on a chain of decisions made under pressure. Hold the formation, control the aircraft, stay focused, and above all, keep flying. For the pilots of the Luftwaffe, these bombers became something difficult to define. They were targets, yes, but also anomalies. Aircraft that absorbed punishment beyond expectation. Machines that disrupted the predictability of combat. Encounters that should have ended quickly instead lingered, stretching into moments of uncertainty. And in those moments, something shifted. Confidence gave way to doubt. Precision gave way to hesitation, because the outcome was no longer guaranteed. Beyond the battlefield, the resilience of these bombers reflected something larger. It spoke to the industrial power that produced them, the ground crews who repaired them, and the system that kept them returning to the sky. A damaged aircraft was not the end of a mission. It was part of a cycle. Repair, refly, repeat, war. Calais was not only about destruction, it was about persistence. Over time, the image of the damaged bomber became a symbol, not polished or untouched, but wounded and still moving forward. Wings scarred, engines smoking, structure barely holding, yet steady enough to cross hundreds of miles and reach home. That image carried weight. It reminded those who flew that survival was possible, and it reminded those who fought against them that victory was never simple. History often remembers the decisive battles, the turning points, the moments where outcomes become clear. But in the skies over Europe, there was another kind of story unfolding, quieter, less defined, yet just as powerful. The story of aircraft that should not have made it, and the story of crews who should not have survived. And in that repetition, mission after mission, return after return, a truth began to take shape. Not all victories are immediate. Not all strength is visible. Sometimes it is measured in endurance. Sometimes it is measured in the ability to keep going when everything else suggests stopping. German crews mocked the damage until they watched those bombers disappear into the distance. Not falling, not breaking, but flying, stubbornly, all the way home.